Welcome back to the deep dive. Ready to go back in time, way back, like 11th century.
Sounds intriguing.
We're diving into this book. It's called Books on the Interpreters of Sacred Scripture
Okay.
by this monk, Notker Labeo, from the Abbey of St. Gall. And the thing is, it was a guide for his student.
Really?
Yeah, Solomon, who later, get this, became the Bishop of Constance.
Wow. So like a textbook on how to interpret the Bible.
Well, not exactly. That's what makes this so cool. Instead of, giving his own interpretations, he's giving Solomon a roadmap to all these other interpreters throughout history.
Oh, interesting. So it's more about understanding how people have approached the Bible over time.
Exactly, like
Huh.
peeking into a medieval classroom. Plus, his writing style. It's not what you'd expect at all.
Oh, how so?
It's engaging, almost funny at times.
No way. A funny monk from the 11th century.
Right. Like, he teases Solomon for asking what he calls trivial questions, even worries about what people will think of them both if Solomon relies on the wrong sources.
That's kind of endearing. Shows they were just as worried about reputation back then.
Totally human, even centuries ago.
Right.
But, okay, let's get to the actual content. Luckily, it's well-organized, chapters devoted to, different parts of the Bible.
That's helpful. Makes it easier to follow.
Right, and he's really opinionated about which interpreters are best for each book. Doesn't hold back.
Give us an example.
Okay, so Genesis. He sends Solomon to three main figures: Jerome, Origen, and Augustine.
Big names, but what are those three specifically?
So Jerome, for the Hebrew perspective,
Yeah.
then Origen, more for moral lessons, and Augustine for the deeper theological arguments.
It's like he's saying there's not just one right way to understand it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Multiple lenses, right?
Multifaceted approach. I like it.
And then with Exodus and Leviticus, it gets even more interesting.
How so?
He specifically recommends Origen's homilies.
Oh, homilies.
Yeah, basically sermons or reflections, so a more practical, faith-oriented lens for those books.
Fascinating. Tailoring the approach to the book itself.
Right, and he does the same with the Psalms. Draws a clear distinction between the Greek and Latin interpretations.
Oh, right. Because back then, the church was essentially divided, east and west.
Exactly. Different theological traditions, even languages. So Origen represents the Greek view, Augustine the Latin.
Reflecting that historical divide.
It's not just about the text itself, but the lens you're viewing it through.
Okay, so what about Proverbs?
He highlights Bede, this English monk who built on Jerome's work.
Bede, of course.
And then Job. That was tough. Notker calls out Gregory the Great's interpretation as groundbreaking.
Oh, yeah, Gregory's Moralia in Job. Amazing work.
It was influential. Okay, now the Gospels get a bit more complex. He recommends different scholars for each one.
Wow, really thought this through. Who does he suggest?
So for Matthew, it's Jerome, Mark and Luke, Bede, and for John, Augustine.
Like a personalized reading list.
And then Romans, there's a bit of drama.
Drama. Spill it.
He loves Origen's work on Romans, but warns Solomon that later editions might have corrupted the original.
Oh, right. The challenges of textual transmission back then.
You got to be critical of the sources themselves.
Absolutely. Okay, I got to ask about this one little detail that stood out to me. He throws shade at Solomon for potentially reading books, get this, aimed at educating women.
Oh, yeah. Just a quick line, but wow.
Yeah.
Tells you a lot about gender and education back then.
What was so wrong with women learning?
Makes you wonder what books he meant.
Totally. And then there's that whole story about Jerome translating the Song of Songs.
From Homilies by Adamantius, who compiled them from Origen. It's layers upon layers.
The history of a text is so important.
And to understand it fully, he wants Solomon to find someone fluent in both Latin and Greek to translate even more. Calls it a wonderful gift.
He's serious about getting those original languages.
He's not just saying what to think, but giving the tools to become a good interpreter.
Empowering. And that's where the book shifts gears a bit.
Yeah, like we finished the first module of the course.
We're going beyond just individual books of the Bible now.
To the bigger picture, right? What it means to be a spiritual leader.
Exactly. It's like we're moving beyond just, understanding each book of the Bible.
Right.
And getting into like the real deal.
The practical stuff.
Yeah.
What does it actually mean to be a spiritual leader? A priest.
Exactly. And so he recommends this book.
Yeah.
Pastoral Rule by Gregory the Great.
Oh, okay.
Like required reading for anyone thinking about the priesthood.
Essential.
He even says, you could call the Pastoral Rule a mirror.
A mirror.
Yeah, like it reflects what a priest's life is actually, like, their duties and all that.
The inner life and the outer actions, everything.
Right, so it's not just a job, it's...
Obation.
Yeah, a way of life.
With a lot of responsibility.
He even questions, maybe Solomon should just avoid the priesthood altogether.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because of the potential dangers from, the people he might not be able to help.
That's heavy.
Right. It's serious business.
Knowler's not messing around.
He is preparing Solomon for the real deal.
Mentoring, basically.
Yeah. And he doesn't just focus on the big concepts.
Right,
He
yeah.
gets into the nitty-gritty too.
Like what?
Well, he says Solomon needs to know the liturgical calendar like the back of his hand.
Okay.
So he can announce things properly to the congregation.
So important.
Right. And he even quotes Ezekiel.
Oh, yeah. What's that about?
It's a warning, basically,
Hurts up.
failing to inform the people.
Ah, I see.
Like if something bad happens and you didn't tell them,
That's on you.
their blood will be on your hands. That's how Ezekiel puts it.
Intense.
Right. But then he kind of lightens things up.
Okay.
He recommends some letters from Jerome.
Okay.
He thinks they'll be relevant to Solomon.
Because of his age and all.
Yeah, and especially the letter to Nepotian.
Nepotian.
He was this young guy, supposed to be a bishop, but then died suddenly.
Oh, wow.
And it's like Notker's saying, hey, a life of piety is more important than,
Ambition.
Exactly.
Humility over power.
It's not just about what you know, it's about who you are.
Character formation.
Right on. And then as we go on, the book kind of expands again.
Expands. How so?
Well, it's not just biblical interpretation anymore.
Oh, just yet.
He starts recommending other types of religious writing.
Like what? Poetry?
Yeah. He talks about Prudentius, this Christian poet.
What did he write about?
All sorts of things. Creation, martyrs, praising God.
Okay, so not just like dry theology.
Well, experiencing faith through poetry.
Makes you wonder what other amazing works are out there.
Right. And Notker even acknowledges that. He says something like, if you're looking for church writers, you might be searching forever.
Because there are always more people writing.
Exactly. Even today, he says.
Wow, like he knew scholarship was ongoing?
He was ahead of his time. But he doesn't stop there. He says Solomon should read about the martyrs.
The martyrs, okay.
Yeah, their stories, their passions.
Well,
Because they can inspire courage, strengthen faith.
powerful examples.
Right. And he's specific, too.
Like, who does he suggest reading about?
Well, he starts with the big names,
Yeah.
Peter and Paul.
Yeah. The main apostles.
Right. And then others like Clement, Alexander.
That's like a whole course on Christian history.
He's giving Solomon a foundation, these key figures.
So then he gets into the historical context even more.
Recommending those classic history books like Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History.
Oh, and Jerome's Illustrious Men.
Right. So we've got biblical interpretation, theology, poetry, stories of saints.
And now actual history chronicles.
He's showing how it's all connected. You can't understand faith without understanding history.
And there's this one recommendation I found really interesting.
What's that?
He tells Solomon to read about St. Lawrence's Passion.
St. Lawrence, okay.
He says Solomon will find many battles and victories of martyrs there.
Oh, right, St. Lawrence. He was a Roman deacon, martyred under Valerian.
During that big persecution of Christians.
Right, and his story was really popular back then.
Because he didn't give up his faith, even when things got really bad.
Exactly. So Notker's connecting that to the challenges Solomon might face as a priest.
Drawing a parallel.
Using history to prepare him.
And speaking of history, he talks about some major events, like the persecution under Decius.
Oh, yeah. Decius tried to wipe out Christianity completely.
In Persia and Rome.
Brutal times. A real test of faith.
But then Notker mentions how Christianity was restored in Persia.
Through Cyriacus, a Roman deacon.
So even in those dark times, there's hope.
Resilience, yeah.
History is not just about the bad stuff. It's about how people overcame those challenges.
And by giving Solomon that broader context.
He's helping him face his own time, his own challenges.
More thoughtfully.
Okay, I got to ask about some of these other figures he mentions in the historical overview.
Sure, which ones?
He talks about monasticism rising in the East.
Yeah.
With people like Basil, Gregory, Athanasius, John.
Oh, yeah, the big names in early monasticism.
They were pioneers.
Building a life around prayer, communal living, scholarship.
And he mentions Paul and Anthony, too.
The Desert Fathers.
Seeking solitude, discipline out in the wilderness.
It's amazing how he brings all these threads together in this one guide for Solomon.
It's like a crash course in early church history.
He's definitely giving a broad view, covering both East and West.
He even says that the West is in no way inferior to the Eastern Church when it comes to saints.
He's not playing favorites.
Just showing the contributions of both sides.
A balanced perspective.
And in the West, he highlights some big names. Martin of Tours, Hilary, Ambrose, Jerome, Augustine.
The heavy hitters of the Western Church.
He even contrasts them with earlier Christian figures from Africa.
Saying that despite being important early on, Africa didn't have the same prosperity as the West.
Meaning fewer influential figures in later centuries.
Right, so he's giving Solomon this grand tour of Christian history
Key players, the movements.
to really drive home his point that knowledge is all connected.
You can't understand faith without understanding its history.
And that's not all. He even encourages Solomon to read pagan authors.
Really? Like who?
Well, he specifically mentions Priscian, a Roman grammarian.
Wow, so open-minded.
He also suggests Josephus, the Jewish historian, and Hegesippus, a Christian one.
So many different viewpoints.
He's not afraid to expose Solomon to ideas that might challenge him.
Expand his understanding.
It's pretty amazing for an 11th century monk.
It makes you wonder, what if Notker were writing this guide today?
Ooh, that's a good question.
With all the resources we have now?
What would he recommend? It would be interesting to see, right? I mean, imagine Notker in a modern library or online with all those books and articles.
He'd probably be blown away.
Right. But I think even with all the new stuff, his basic idea would be the same.
The core principles.
Yeah, find different voices, get the historical context, and, be humble.
Don't just accept everything you read.
Think critically. So for the Bible, instead of Jerome and Augustine,
Who would he go to?
maybe scholars like N.T. Wright
Oh, okay.
or Bart Ehrman.
I've heard of him, yeah.
They're known for taking a historical approach, really rigorous.
Not just accepting things at face value.
Right, and he might even suggest feminist theologians like Elizabeth Schussler, Fiorenza,
Oh,
or scholars from, different parts of the world, not just the West.
expanding the horizons.
He'd probably say something like, don't just read the same old voices, get some fresh perspectives.
Yawns the status quo.
Exactly. And for history, sure, he might still recommend Eusebius and Jerome, but
But also newer stuff.
yeah, more recent scholarship with, the latest archaeological discoveries and all that.
Okay, so who comes to mind?
Well, maybe historians like Peter Brown or Dyer-Maid McCulloch.
I'll have to check him out.
And I bet he'd encourage Solomon to read primary sources too, letters and diaries and stuff.
Oh, I love primary sources.
They're so powerful, right? It's like hearing those voices from the past.
Direct connection.
And don't forget about poetry and those stories of the saints.
The hagiography.
Yeah, he wouldn't ditch those.
So for poetry, maybe he'd recommend modern Christian poets like Mary Oliver or Christian Wiven.
Yeah, I could see that. They're deep, but accessible too.
And for the saints, maybe he'd look to Black liberation theology.
Oh, that's a good one.
People like Martin Luther King Jr., James Cone.
He'd be all about expanding the canon, I think.
It's amazing to think this guide from centuries ago is still relevant today.
It really is.
It's like a blueprint for being a lifelong learner.
Always searching, always questioning.
And never stop learning.
Exactly. And it takes humility, being open to different voices, different ideas.
That's a great takeaway.
The quest for understanding never really ends.
It's a journey.
And that's what makes it so exciting.
Well, that's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into Notker Labeo's books on the interpreters of sacred scripture.
It's been a pleasure. I always love exploring these hidden gems.
And to all of you listening out there, we hope you enjoyed this journey back to the 11th century.
And we hope it inspires you to keep learning, keep exploring.
There's a whole world of knowledge out there just waiting to be discovered.
So go out there and find your own wonderful gift.
Happy reading.